I'm just going to give a really brief bio. There are more notes online if you'd like to know more, or I'm sure he'd love to talk about all of his busy activities over the years. But he is a retired Bridgewater College history professor with over 50 years of experience researching his ancestors and other aspects of local Shenandoah Valley history. He has written numerous books and articles, and fortunately for all of us and those coming in the future, he still feels he has a lot to learn. Isn't that awesome? His interest in discovering more about his ancestors and his focus on local history comes from his conviction, and I love this, that real history is made by everyone and is the story of all of us living and working together, not just the actions of the powerful and famous. So let's have a warm welcome for Daniel Bott.
Ooh, that sounded like a whole auditorium. So I'm glad we have good acoustics in here. Can you all hear me? Well, okay. Yeah, well, I'm happy to be here and very happy that they asked me. And it's interesting because the Shenandoah Valley has got, from its very beginnings, had a lot of diverse groups. I mean, you had the early settlers coming in here from, they were Scotch-Irish, they were Germans, some were Welsh, they were English, so they were even different religions. They were, from the Anglican and the Lutheran and the Mennonite background. That was very early on. And even later, of course, you had, some of them began to be slaveholders. So you had the African people, and then eventually more Irish came in. And so we've always been a diverse group. And eventually, I think, since these other groups were mostly Protestant, eventually you've got a few Catholics, but the Jews were about the last of the bigger groups of the major religions and groups to come. But they've always been one of the smaller ones too. So I think the fact that they were last and were smaller, you might say, well, that's not very, they weren't very important, but I do think it was very consequential. And some of the things I want to talk about, I think will illustrate that. Of course, why were they last or the latest of those groups to come? And when was that? Well, there were probably some Jews in Virginia about the time of the Revolutionary War, but they were in Richmond and maybe Alexandria, and were Sephardic Jews who had probably come up from the Caribbean or from Holland, that the Jews that had escaped or their ancestors had escaped the Spanish expulsion. So, but that was the ones that later came into the valley were almost all exclusively German Jews, German-speaking Jews. They weren't German people, I guess. But they, and so why were they the latecomers? And I think there's some very good reasons for that. For one thing, in Europe, or I should say, what were all the early settlers looking for? Looking for land. They wanted land to expand. Most of them were peasant farmers, and some craftsmen. Almost peasant farmers were also good craftsmen. But the Jews were not going to be looking for land, because for centuries they'd never been able to own any. They were not farmers. They were restricted to what they could do in Europe. And that was, land was for only the Christians, and in fact, the peasants didn't even own it. They were owned by the owners of the land. But the Jews, they were restricted, usually they had to stay in one place. They couldn't move without special permissions. And they could only occupy certain positions of labor. They could be in commerce, trading basically, and maybe some handcrafts, making stuff, which they could then trade. And so were into buying and selling things. And so that's how they made a living, basically. And were very restricted to that. were not interested in farming. And so they were restricted to where they had to their communities. Traveling, the idea of being able to even immigrate if they wanted to get out of Europe, how would they get there? Where would they go? Because even traveling, let's say, to a port, getting on a ship would probably have been very difficult because they still had their traditional garb. And of course, religiously, unless you want to totally violate your religious rules, you had eating custom traditions and actual duties and the whole kosher laws and sanitary laws and what you had, when and how you could pray and so forth like that. So even traveling would have been even difficult if they'd wanted to go. So they didn't. But then, of course, along came, like the American Revolution and the French Revolution with some rather new ideas that everybody in a country should be treated equally by the government, regardless of their religion or race or social background. And so those ideas took root in France, and then Napoleon took over France after the revolution kind of went through several cycles. And while he became somewhat of a dictator in France, he then actually believed in and spread many of the ideas of the French Revolution and took them, and then in order to defend the revolution, he had to go to war with all these neighbors, but they didn't win. And he just expanded into Germany and abolished the old Holy Roman Empire and all those multi-states and some big ones and little ones where most of the Jews lived, at least in Western Europe. There were some a lot more further east under Russian rule. And he just wiped out all of the old rules and laws. And so for the first time they had freedom. So many of them moved, a lot of them joined Napoleon's armies. They were so happy that somebody was going to support these ideas. But then eventually Napoleon lost. And people decided to we're going to kind of put things back the way they were. Of course, even before the French Revolution, there were a couple of enlightened rulers in Europe, particularly old Frederick the Great of Prussia, and then Joseph II of Austria, who came in and had some of those same enlightened ideas that the French Revolution had, only they thought that the government could kind of ease in some of those reforms. And so for instance, in Austrian Empire, which was ruled by the Habsburgs, it was Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and parts of Italy, huge empire. He specifically passed laws that allowed the Jewish, for instance, to join the Austrian army. All Jews had to now take regular hereditary family names, because before they weren't allowed to. Only Christians had last names. And so, and some of the other restrictions. In Austria, for instance, at least in Bohemia, I'm not sure that was true in Hungary under the state, Jews were restricted to a particular house, a particular family of that name, and it could only pass to the oldest son, or if not the oldest son, and if he died, you could go to the second son, or it could, if there's no sons, it could go to the daughter if she married and it went to her husband. And what happened to all the children? They had to leave, go somewhere else. They might find a bride who's, if it's a daughter, they might be able to stay if they could find somebody who also inherited this marital right. So it was kind of rough. And by eliminating a lot of those, so then when the authorities got all the powers of Europe got back together in Vienna in 1815, they reshaped the map and put a lot of the old rulers back in place. And they all thought, oh, it's going to be like it was before. But too many things had changed. Not only had so many people already enjoyed some freedoms, but the very early edges of the Industrial Revolution were creeping in. And that was offering even more opportunities for people in the class like the Jews had. They could become the middling class in a world in which trade and commerce and products were becoming more important. So they saw reasons for then wanting to leave. And so that's when, about 1815, but when did they finally come into the Shenandoah Valley? Well, when you get over here, the Shenandoah Valley is, of course, agricultural, and it had produce. I mean, it was a very prosperous valley by then, by the time of the American Revolution. In fact, it had already gotten to the point where most of the land had been taken, and even some of their children were moving on across the mountain once after the Revolution, because all that was now America. And so this was a very interesting area. And as about 1850, early 1800s, Jews were beginning to settle in the ports like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston, and New Orleans. It's kind of just the ports, because now those who came over, they were busy became basically wholesalers. You know, you bought up or acquired all the stuff that just came off of a ship, and then you sold it then to the people who were going to take it out to the countryside and sell it to consumers. And so Baltimore, for instance, became a very important port because it's way up in the Chesapeake, and so it had access to areas inland that even Philadelphia or Boston or sometimes even New York didn't have, because you were close to the heart of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, the whole eastern shore. And so Baltimore became probably the biggest Jewish settlement in the early 1800s. Philadelphia was big and New York was big. And then about that time, the railroad was beginning to get people's attention. In the 1820s, the British started building some railroads. The steam engine had already been around since the 1780s, but now applying it to transportation was very exciting. And in Baltimore, they put together a company, the Baltimore and Ohio, that started building a railroad from Baltimore westward. They wanted to go all the way to the Ohio River to Wheeling, what's now West Virginia, which meant crossing parts of northern Virginia and kind of getting out there. And I think they formed the company in 1830. By 1834, they had reached Harper's Ferry on the Potomac. And in Winchester, a number of businessmen got very excited about that because now, it took a whole week to get up to Baltimore with a wagon load of stuff or bring a wagon load back. A railroad up to Baltimore, 4 hours. So they started putting together the Winchester Potomac Railroad Company, and they built a railroad from Winchester to Harper's Ferry. And so the train was able to go from Baltimore to Winchester by 1836. And almost immediately, of course, these merchants, Jewish merchants in Baltimore, were thrilled because now we can send young men out there to peddle the countryside. And so they started sending peddlers. And why young Jewish men? Well, for one thing, they were the ones who were immigrating because, like I say, a lot of the other things, there was still kind of a restrictive, and for women it was even worse. Because women were also very protected and their patriarchal way. So a lot of the young Jewish men who had to leave because they couldn't marry and stay where they were now ideal candidates to go out and peddle goods. And so they started, Hasia Diner, who wrote a wonderful book on this called The Path They Took, called that the Winchester Trail, because she actually found that in some records of the peddlers themselves referring to it. If you got down to Winchester, you could go out to Hampshire County, on down or up the valley, I guess they call it, or the Winchester Trail. And By 1840, some of the merchants in the stores in Woodstock and Strasburg in Shenandoah County petitioned the Virginia General Assembly to do something about the obnoxious foreign peddlers infesting the countryside. And because they were running their work and their business, and they wanted to impose higher fees for their licensing or forbid foreigners from getting licenses and all that. And that hit the General Assembly in 1840. I don't think they passed anything, but the the petition got drawn up. And you can find it on the web. I found it on the website of the Virginia Library. And you look at some of those names on that list there. They're very recognizable if you come from Shenandoah County. Anyway, it was about that time, however, that two young men from a little town named Königswart in Bavaria, in Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, sort of the northwest corner there, almost in Germany, named Moritz and Adolf Heller, arrived in Baltimore in 1840. I found them on the ship list, and they gave their age, so it fit perfectly with the ages I later found in the Jewish records of Bohemia. And so, next thing you know, they're in Shenandoah County applying for a merchant's license, and they get it. And by October of 1834, they had a store in Marytown, right there, just north of Woodstock. And they advertised in that store for all kinds of fabrics and clothes and hats and leather goods, even chinaware, glassware, and they said, all the best things from Germany and the ports of this country. And this was it in the news, an advertisement in the newspaper. And so it was called Heller and Brother store. And I saw somewhere else where some liberal meeting of some political group was having a meeting at, like in 1841 or two, Heller's store. And that's what they didn't say Marytown, they said Heller's store. So that already became a very important. And then the thing that happens here, this is where it gets interesting, you see, and why I entitled this Here to Stay. I'm convinced they came over earlier and peddled, because most of these Jewish people, they started out getting experience as a peddler, then settled down to make stores. That was the pattern. And why did they come straight to Baltimore instead of New York, where most of them came to? That was not necessarily always true. Sailboats got into storms and got rerouted and so forth, but I think they arrived in Baltimore about 1836 or 7, because Moritz Heller was the oldest of his family in Königswart. He got married in 1834, I think it's about 34. And his wife died a year later of childbirth, and the baby died. And so here he is, desolate, probably wanted to get out of there as fast as he could. So he and a younger brother probably came over here and peddled a while, because he seemed to know where he was going. Now, how did he wind up, getting to Marytown if he didn't know that, maybe that was a good place to go? And so I think he did. I think he came back after he had probably already done some and he was probably one of those obnoxious people infesting the countryside. So he came back, and see his father back, and they, Jews were restricted, but he was one who had very fortunate, because his father had almost a kind of a permanent job, family job that he passed along as the distiller on the Schloss, which means the palace of the biggest, richest guy in town. And that happened to be none other than Prince Metternich, who was the chancellor of the emperor of the Austrian Empire. So, Emanuel Harrier and his big family were in pretty good condition. So that was also because he went back and got the capital he needed to set him up as a store. How else could he have gotten it, if he did? And so from that point onward, there was actually good postal service between the United States and Europe. From that point onward, they kept in touch, and within a year, some of his nephews, he had a lot of them, who were just coming of age, arrive, and they are sent out peddling. So he can go, they can go up and pick up a wagon load of stuff, or even take the train into Baltimore to make their orders and come back with a wagon load of stuff, haul it down to Morristown, and then the nephews are out peddling. And this became a pattern. And he, by about 1847, he'd already had enough of these nephews out peddling that he decided to turn the store in Morristown over to one of the nephews. And he went on and moved into Woodstock now, which of course would have been a prize before, because those Woodstock merchants didn't want these peddlers, but now here's was one that was probably bring some business into the store, because now he's got all the connections up in Baltimore they don't have. So he goes into Woodstock and turns his store there, and the brother goes over to Psalmsville and starts the store. So you have two stores right there just north of Woodstock, out in the countryside. Then by that time, more nephews are coming in, and he sends them further south. And by 1849, a couple of brothers by the last name of Lowenbach, were his nephews, were in Dayton. And now, in the 1840s, the railroad had never gotten any further than Winchester. So that's kind of getting really stretching it. But he does have that going off as far as Dayton. And buying up houses. They bought up a couple pieces of property, which they were planning to stay or bring more people in, and that's exactly what they did. And so the Lowenbachs were going off to Dayton, and this is the late 1840s. And now you've got stores, a couple of different stores around, and there's talk of another railroad coming up from Alexandria to Strasburg, the Manassas Gap Railroad. And in 1854, it was done. Now, why didn't a railroad from Winchester come? The Virginia General Assembly would not approve it, would not give them. They did not want any more Virginia stuff going out of Virginia. You had to use railroads in Virginia. So that was going to benefit the Manassas Gap Railroad. And what the Manassas Gap Railroad was able to do, as soon as they got to Strasburg, they put in plans to go on down the valley. And they started laying off the track, and by 1856, they had gotten to Woodstock. Now, that was quite a job, because if you drive from Strasburg to Woodstock, you're going, and so some of those bridges had to span some pretty deep valleys. And you can still see them if you drive up Route 11. And then, of course, in those days, they were wooden trestles. But anyway, so that made a big difference. Once you have the store in Woodstock, that now becomes the railhead, and you can extend even further south. And eventually, then more people keep coming in. And another thing that made a big difference here, too, is remember, this is young single men. By 1854, families are coming. Why? Steamships. particularly for Jewish families, very hardship in terms of food and hygiene and everything else when it takes 2 months to cross in an old sailboat, sailing ship. But a steamship could do it in 2 weeks in comfort. And so women and children could make it. And in 1854, one of it wasn't even a nephew of this, it was a cousin who already had a wife and child back in Bohemia, but he was going to come over and make sure they got started, and then she would come as soon as they were settled. Well, they already had a house for him in Dayton. And so that's where he came. And then the next year, his wife, who in the meantime had another baby, because they'd been about 6 months after he left, and she had another baby, she travels from Shenandoah all the way to, Dayton with 2 little girls, one an infant. So that was quite a trip. And from that point onward, then even families could come. And that was Samuel Lohner. And the Lohners eventually became an important long-term family in Harrisonburg. I'll talk maybe a little bit more about him. But then eventually, about 2 years later, Samuel Lohner's brother came. He was single, but he came and then started working for his father. And again, you're moving about. I think it was his brother Emmanuel, and one of the Lowenbach boys took over the store in Dayton, and Samuel moved off to New Hope. You've ever heard of New Hope? It's down there between there on the east side of the county towards Staunton. And he stayed there until after the Civil War. So in the meantime, another cousin, Jonas Heller, comes over, and he settles down in around Mount Crawford, and then out and tried to put up a store in Sangersville before the Civil War. And another cousin named Louis Levy, who changed his name to John Smith, he wanted to be more American, set up a store in Mount Crawford and married a local woman. So now you've got stores all the way from Winchester, Frederick County down into Augusta County. And the railroad had only just gotten to Woodstock. By the time the Civil War came along, 1860, the road had reached Mount Jackson, and with plans, of course, to eventually go into Harrisonburg by way of Broadway. And at that point, even just before the Civil War, the brother of Moritz and Adolf Heller, Herman Heller, with the one who had the wife and kids that come over in 1856, moved to Edom, north of Harrisonburg, which is for the store that was going to also be the depot there when the railroad got there. And like Moritz and a couple of the others, he became postmaster of Edom almost right away. Moritz Heller wound up being postmaster at Tom's Brook. Why? You say, well, because they were educated and bilingual. How? They learned English in Bohemia because remember their father being well off? One of the other nephews wrote up a little biography, and he said that, all of Grandpa's children got a good education. They got sent to schools in Vienna. Now, this is while they was, Jews were still kind of restricted, but if they had some money, they had Jewish institutions where they, and he said that the old man paid up for midwives and for not midwives, but the ladies who nursed their babies for his daughters. He didn't want them to, they were to have good, happy lives, He paid for businesses to put his sons-in-laws. So he came from a fairly well-off family. So they actually had English and French tutors. So that gave them an advantage. Another thing, of course, that gave these peddlers an advantage was the fact that most of the farmers in Shenandoah County and Western Rock and Hammering spoke German. And these guys spoke German also. And they came in there offering things that they needed and wanted. And so they were very welcomed, and they were respected. A lot of the English merchants didn't like the Valley Germans. They called them the dumb Dutch and things like that, and didn't like giving them credit. And but the Jewish peddlers were there to try to sell things, so they were going to treat them well so they could, they might need a place to stay that night. And what did they have? Well, you see, they had a lot of the little things that you might even be luxuries, or you might even decide a lot of things for the household that the women might want. Buttons, a nice little piece. A backpack, you're not going to carry big bolts of cloth, but you might have lots of rolls of ribbons and lace and some fine silk handkerchiefs and things like that. And you're going to have lots of buttons and pins and even a little bit of costume jewelry, a mirror or two, scissors. They would even sharpen knives for you if you did. But if the knife was getting so old, I'll take that in trade. They took scrap metal in trade. And so that made them very welcome. And I think the other thing is that, I kind of compare the establishment and how that made a difference to these people. Women could now go to a store. They couldn't do that before. The man had to take a day off from work and go in and do this, get some shopping and get whatever tools he wanted, maybe some coffee and tea or whatever, some things for the household. Took a whole day just to do that, maybe 2 days, because once in there, maybe he had some business at the courthouse. You can't get home at night. So, or even the kids could be sent to those. And there were things like candy and little gifts and toys, little luxuries. And so the difference it made to life for all these people way out in the countryside in the world at that time, it was a big deal. I compare it in some ways to rural electrification in the 1930s in terms of the kind of difference it made. But then disaster. What happened in 1860-61? The Civil War. Ruined everything in a sense. It was broken because it cut off whatever contacts they had with the outside world. How are you going to trade in Baltimore if you have Confederate cash? That's not going to work. What are you going to do now? How are you going to supply these swords? We can't get the goods. By that time, a railroad had reached Staunton. That's what the Crozet Tunnel was dug for, so that Staunton could get the railroad by 1854. But they connected with Richmond. And of course, not much was coming in through any British, American ports from Britain or England because of blockade. So they were cut off. You had to make do. Some of them went back, some of them during things began to get bad, and a few of them ran back just to Baltimore, where at least it was a little better. You could still get some stuff and you could still work. But some of them actually began taking off to Milwaukee. Some of the nephews at the time of the Civil War, after the war broke out, some of them that were going to come to Virginia went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So during the war, some of the others went. So what happens is some of them began to move out. And so the stores and the things kind of folded up. But in a way, another thing began to happen here that made a difference, because the ones that didn't move away moved into, all places, Harrisonburg. Kind of a centralized area. There was already one or two merchants there. The earliest one was Gabriel Hirsch and his brother, probably, and another guy that had a shoe store named Leopold. Last name was Leopold. But anyway, by 1860, another family had come from the Königsberg area, and that was Leopold Weiss and his sons, who were already grown young men. But he was related because Herman Heller, who had come over in 1850, one of the Hellerman, was married to Leopold Weiss's sister. So they were all kind of related. But it's interesting because Weiss, in a sense now, as being sort of the older one, became sort of the patriarch of this little new Harrisonburg community. And people from the countryside kind of moved in there and they kind of consolidated. And what they did was they now became middlemen again by buying stuff from the countryside, the butter and the eggs and even maybe some handcrafts and stuff to sell to the other townspeople. They didn't get a lot of goods like the peddlers had, but they could, sell cured ham and bacon and eggs and butter to the town people, because otherwise the town people would have to go out to this farm and that farm just to get what they needed, or the farmers couldn't go taking things around to all the houses. So that became at least helpful, but it forced them to consolidate in town. And the war was kind of rough. There's in Staunton, one of the nieces, one of the other relatives had settled there, and they had such a tough time. They managed to get out and go to Milwaukee. They weren't going to stay there. So after the war was over, actually a couple of the Wise boys, and I think Jonas Heller and a couple of the Wise boys who had just arrived joined the Confederate Army. And I don't think that turned out very well. When they got out, they were glad to get out. And I don't think it had anything to do with sympathy for the Confederacy. They didn't know what was what. This is our new country. We better, young men, we better do what we ought to, do the right thing here. So they joined the Confederate Army. And after the war then, some of them started to come back. But things had changed now, and somehow there was a whole different atmosphere. In the country, the Shenandoah Valley began to snap back fairly well. Farmers started making what they did best, and that is produce good crops, and things started getting a lot better. And pretty soon you could start getting produce from the north. The railroads were rebuilt pretty quickly. So now it's kind of like starting over. But what had happened is some of the ones who left Harrisonburg and Shenandoah County and went back up to Baltimore actually set up new wholesale businesses there, and they made themselves now the people who were going to set up stores back in Harrisonburg, because they knew the railroad was going to be extended further. So here was a good opportunity to start sending more people down to Harrisonburg in particular, because it was, you didn't have the railroad there yet, but that was moving that way. And in fact, it reached there in 1868. They were really pushing that. And so these Baltimore, who had that connection with Baltimore, and they started sending people down to set up stores in town. And usually they set up a storefront. Most of the hotels and even some of the houses downtown had a storefront. So that's where you could start out. And so a number of different new families. One of the people that came in that period was Baruch Ney, who preferred that after he got to call himself B. Ney. That became his name and signature. And he started out as a major clothier and sort of a general store type thing. And then eventually, well, he was with a brother-in-law. Eventually, he wanted to go more into specializing into clothing, and the brother-in-law stayed with the general store type. So he's kind of moving up here. There was a William Loeb came in. He stayed there for many years after that. So pretty soon you're getting more downtown business. And the same thing began to happen in Staunton. And in the countryside, the country store idea had been so good that by this time you now had locals, not Jewish people, but the local people who said, we can do this now. We know people that could help us get started. We know we're going to have, it'll be easy. The railroad's going to be able to bring in goods here pretty soon. So it wasn't long till in almost all of the villages and towns around, some local people were setting up their own stores in kind of a copying what they enjoyed having before the war. And so the country store became, a major economic component of the up and down the Shenandoah Valley, right on up until probably about the 1960s and 70s. Most of them are gone now. A few have been kind of restored as little specialty shops or something, so for tourists. But yeah, that concept became very important. But in the towns now, the stores became much more specialized. Shoe stores, boots and shoes, glassware, chinaware, men's clothes, or even if you were a department store like the days, you had a ladies' bazaar department, often run by a wife or daughter. It became a sort of a new model for businesses. And by the 1880s, it was interesting, but the 1880s, Harrisonburg had 71 Jews, at least, who had joined, they had formed a congregation in 1868 and were holding regular services, usually over with just lay leaders. I had one or two short-term rabbis, but they, in the meantime, had to make some reports to the Reformed Jewish National Organization. And so in 1880, which is kind of a very interesting year in Harrisonburg for the Jewish community, because their census to the Reformed National Reform was 71 people. That was 71 people. I think it was 35 households. But of the 70, in those 35 households, something like 40 of the 71 people were under 20. So, big families were coming along here. And that's another reason why they'd already formed a congregation. They usually met in one of the meeting halls of one of the larger downtown buildings. And the same thing was happening in Staunton. Staunton was a bigger town than Harrisonburg, but it never had a larger Jewish population than Harrisonburg. That 1880 report, they had only 57 people, and I think 30 some under 20. So it was a smaller congregation, but by 1885, they actually bought an old schoolhouse as a synagogue, temple for worship. Harrisonburg hadn't done anything yet by that time. But let's go back a minute to 1880. It was kind of interesting because it was beginning to see that they're going to need one with a population like that. But it said, I found a news article in one of the old Commonwealth, one of the old newspapers, that mentioned that the Jews, the Hebrew population celebrated Yom Kippur, was sort of the celebrating. It said that this past week, it said by reason of all the businesses closed, downtown had the appearance of Sunday. So you know how important those businesses were. It was about that. So the people in Staunton finally in 1885 bought that as well. So, the pressure in Harrisonburg was, well, we need to do something too. And so finally in about 1889, they set up a commission do we buy something or do we build?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, great.
Everything okay? All right, yeah. It's kind of interesting though, because up in Winchester, there were Jews there from very early on, even though that was the railhead, you'd have thought there would have been businesses there, but there weren't a whole lot. There were a couple that kind of were there till the Civil War and they ran off. And then there were some families that came in. There was a cone guy, had a general store. There was one business in Winchester. There was a Heller family. They were not related to the ones that I talked about earlier, had moved into Staunton just before the Civil War from Eastern Virginia, Richmond or somewhere down there, and was in Staunton. It was a pretty big family. And they moved up to, then after the Civil War, they moved up to Washington, where the head of the family died, and his wife and some of her older sons moved to Winchester, back up into Winchester. And her name is Pauline, and the store was P. Heller and Sons. I mean, here was a woman, said she was the owner, and she made her own beauty products, which she sold by mail. If she was willing to sell it to you parcel post, but you can also go to her store and buy her beautifiers. So yeah, that was. But it's kind of interesting because, like I say, Winchester was a bigger town, but it just never quite. They didn't get a synagogue until 1908. I think part of it is the proximity to Washington and Northern Virginia. A lot of them, if they wanted to go to a synagogue, they just hopped on the train, went to Alexandria. And so it wasn't enough people there to make it worthwhile to have their own. So it's kind of interesting that really by the end of the 1800s, which is where I end my book, Harrisonburg had the largest, most thriving Jewish population. Staunton was not far behind. They had some very prominent businesses. The Ney families in Harrisonburg, Isaac Witz, and somebody blocking on the other family there, Barth. Yeah, the Barths were fairly prominent in Staunton. But Harrisonburg seemed to be this pretty much the center, really, because of eventually there was a family in Elkton where they had a store, and out at one of the members of that family had a store up in Luray. They all became members of the Harrisonburg Temple. Front Royal, I never found any mention of anything over in Front Royal. I'm not sure why. Should have been some peddlers go over that way, but I haven't found any. But I think one of the other things, when I mentioned the country store model having been so influential and important, I think the business in Harrisonburg in particular, the number of businesses there did have a big impact and made a big difference. Maybe one of the reasons why, and I think it had to do with that contact with Baltimore. Not only were people that had been in the Valley now up in Baltimore, some of them, even after the Civil War, they moved back up and retired. Old Mrs. Heller, the wife of Herman Heller, he died during the Civil War. She was in Harrisonburg, but she finally moved to Baltimore with some of her children. And some of those who had gone to Milwaukee didn't come back here, they went to Baltimore. But they maintained permanent contact with Harrisonburg and often had business connections there. And so I think that business connection with Baltimore, because of the railroad, which was finally in 1868, made even better because they made the connection between Winchester and Strasburg. So you didn't have to go up and over to Washington and Alexandria. It was more direct, straight up and over. And I think that was part of it. And that also benefited all the little country stores and other businesses in the other towns because they were often connected then with the businesses in Harrisonburg. Staunton, on the other hand, I think what happened there was the railroad from Harrisonburg to Staunton didn't get built until 1878. Much later. Their ties were always with Richmond and the East. And so it is kind of interesting that I think the effect of that was it makes Harrisonburg area and everything north of it more like Pennsylvania or the North. In other words, a lot of people here think, well, we're in the South, or this is South, or you see the guys with their pickup trucks with lots of Confederate flags. The Shenandoah Valley never was the South. And I think it was the strong Jewish presence, particularly after the Civil War, that so that we didn't, even during the whole bird machine years in the 20th century, the Shenandoah County and Rockingham County were the only two counties that often had did not have a majority of people voting for Byrd's Democratic Party. And if you look at the statistics, every other county in Virginia, they had a Byrd machine government, even the county, no opposition. You're a Democrat Byrd or a Byrd Democrat or whatever they called them, but not Shenandoah and Rockingham. And I think it was that northern contact that made that difference. Because if you think this is the South, all you have to do is go down to Staunton. That's a southern city. And it always was. And so I think it made the difference because they didn't have that same connection with the North. It was always more the East and the South. Other questions? I'm sure somebody had some.
You have a question? I have a question for you. It's from the.
Okay. Someone online wants to know, was there pressure on the young Jewish merchants to join the Confederate Army, or the ones that went north, did they stay in business or join the Union Army?
I don't think they were under any external pressure to join the Confederate Army. Because I think they were just young men who thought, oh, this is my new country. I better just do what's right if we want to stay here. But there were Gabriel Hirsch, a merchant in Staunton, who had been there since about 18. When he started, he was in Harrisonburg, he went down to Staunton, and he had, as things heating up, he put ads in the Staunton paper. I am for the Union and the Constitution. And during the war, he apparently, when he and his wife and their child decided they were going to head north, a Union officer escorted them and told his commander that I'm doing this because these people provided us with valuable information. I'm going to protect them. So it varied. Adolph Wise, who had joined the army, I think he spent about 2 years in there. He was the older son of Leopold Wise, the heir to the throne. Yeah, he was the heir to the store, and so he was out, and he, in the meantime, had met actually the stepdaughter of Gabriel Wise, Gabriel Hirsch in Staunton. She was a young lady who was an orphan that he adopted. She wasn't Jewish, but she was brought up in a Jewish home, Fanny. And Adolf had met Fanny and more or less became engaged and corresponded. And the letters they wrote, or most of the ones that he wrote to her, are in our archives at the temple. But he, a couple of the letters, he said, I am so sick and tired of this war. I just hope the blue coats, meaning the North, win soon. And in fact, then not too long after that, he and his brother were trying to get somewhere, and I think they were trying to maybe go find some things for the store by trying to go north. Were attacked by some Confederate soldiers who were probably renegade and trying to rob them, and they managed to get away. So that turned him even more against, I think, even thinking about being a member of the Confederacy. But like I say, yes, there were others who just went north. They didn't want to.
Oh, sorry, I got a very specific question for you. We have an intern here who just did a paper about Manuel Klingstein, I don't know how to say it.
Oh, Klingstein, yes.
Yeah, Cap Klingstein, Klingstein, I think.
Yeah.
Stein, sorry. Anyway, he was a member of the Jewish community, but I think he was also kind of notorious in the area. Maybe, do you know anything about him?
Not a whole lot, but you're right. I think he was kind of notorious. I think he was called captain because he was in World War I, but he owned a lot of property in town. I do know that he was often called the Harrisonburg slumlord. And in fact, a lot of his property was what they finally bulldozed out there for all of that Northeast development. And if that was the case, he probably was a slumlord. He had I remember somebody was looking for information on him who was doing work on that whole development. And we have his will in the article. I pulled out his will. He had a wife that they divorced, but he left her a lot of things in the will, but most of it went to some kind of a fund that was managed to a little bit of money to different groups and so forth. Yeah. But other than, I'm not sure, I don't know whether he did much more than just his landlord stuff. I know he had a nice little retreat out near Raleigh, because I had a friend who lived out there on some property, and there was a little cemetery on her property. And I said, it was right near the creek, and it looked like it had gotten some flood damage, so so I couldn't read any stones. And I said, oh, must have been an old, no, those were Klingstein's dogs.
I'm really curious about what inspired you
to research and to write this story?
Well, I was just because, I wasn't born Jewish, was raised in Shenandoah County, but I married into a Jewish family, was determined to raise my children Jewish, and in 1970, I joined the temple here with the family, and I found it suited me more than I'd been brought up. I'd never been baptized. I was brought up by a family where my mother went to church, my father didn't. And on Sunday mornings, we were just sent to the nearby Sunday school at Fisher's Hill, I think to get us out of the house. I loved the Bible stories, most of which were Old Testament. And so later on, when people said, "Oh, don't you want to join my church?" No, I'm not interested. I just couldn't. But Reformed Judaism just seemed to fit me. And I was always interested in this because I loved the history of the Shenandoah Valley. I thought this is something that's missing.
Mhm.
Is there another one in the room? Okay, I think we have an online.
Were there Jewish optometrists who would come through on the train, check vision on a train car for a day, and then bring the glasses on the next trip through, with some eventually setting up shop? It's a very specific question.
If I would met an optometrist and on a train, and they were able to get me glasses. So what's the rest of the question?
If there were Jewish optometrists who would come through on the train,
Yeah.
check vision, and then bring the glasses on the next trip through.
Well, and what if he did what? I'm not.
Jewish optometrists acting as peddlers.
Oh, as a peddler. Oh, you're talking about somebody sort of standing in and as a peddler, and how would we be received?
Well, they would come to your town on the train, set up a quick shop, like a magic shop, and then get back on the train and go back to Baltimore and then bring your glasses back on the next trip. That's what it,
Well, could they have done that?
yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. You probably would have had to order, if there was, you would have ordered them and it would come back maybe next week. So for somebody to do it, because of nothing. Setting up shop would require a good bit of machinery and equipment and so forth. A peddler probably wouldn't have been able to do that.
Anybody else? Okay.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great insight to a lot of details. I want you to know that we have just been in Daniel Bly's classroom because he has no notes here and no PowerPoint. So thank you.
I could have done a PowerPoint. I've done it in classes, but there was a lack of the kind of materials that I would use here. I have a few pictures in the book, but that's about it. A lot of the old Harrisonburg does not do a good job of keeping their old downtown architectures. We don't have much left there. And a lot of these families, there are a few descendants, like we have one or two members of the temple who are descendants of some early settlers. Not many, and you just can't run them all down somewhere. You find the kind of stuff you want.
Okay. So the next time you're in Bella Luna, you can think about the Hirsch brothers. So there is a little bit of architecture left, and enjoy your pizza. I love the fact that you foreshadowed our May 3rd Thursday talk, which is about general stores.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
we can learn about the general stores that he was referring to with Linda Petsky and Nancy Sorrells. May, whatever that 21st.
That sounds wonderful.
One of the things I forgot to say in terms of our one community, many cultures, what's it called? I don't know why I can't remember.
E pluribus unum.
Many stories, many stories.
Stories.
Is that we have the pop-up museum from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I call it a pop-up because they have a big exhibition in Richmond right now it's called We the People, the World in Our Commonwealth. And they have a little traveling exhibit that literally we pull up a banner and you can read it. And we added some texture to it with some interactives. And today we had fourth graders from Keister Elementary School. And one of our interactives is putting a pin on your location of your family. And they added about 5 or 6 more pins to the world map, which was really fun. So since Harrisonburg and Rockingham have such a broad, we have so many cultures represented, it's really great that we can bring this exhibit from the VMHC so we can celebrate not only the community of the Commonwealth, but the community that we live in. So there's that. It's there until the 25th, which is next Saturday. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, please come back and bring somebody with you. Well, let's say another thank you to Daniel Blythe. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have your little conversations and safe travels home. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.